Thirdly, if the presence of distinct sewage odor, black or gray coloration, or the presence of organic matter on the surface of the ground, and one of the following: the presence of sewage identified through a dye test. 2, the presence of fecal coliform bacteria greater than 5,000, so that's fecal, E. coli greater than 1,030. The standard we now use today most commonly is E. coli. The old one, we always used to use fecal coliform, but anymore today, everybody's testing for E. coli. So that's 1,030. That's where the old pre-1977 aerator requirement comes in. Those old aerators, some of them were not able to get the threshold of E. coli bacteria that low. So that's where that test comes in from. And also if the system is not meeting the NPDES standards it was installed under. So if you had an NPDES system that it can't meet the standards, it's considered a public health nuisance. Those are graduated. You know, there's some leeway in there with the NPDES systems, but when you get some of these way off types of sample results, then it is a public health nuisance. It does need to be resolved. Does that help clarify? For those of you who are property inspectors, that's what you want to define in your, when you say it's a problem, it's off of this. In fact, at the top of your form, property inspectors, at the top of your form, it says a problem as identified under ORC 3718.011. So that's the section you're using to say it's a problem or not on your form. In fact, it says, this is Jason's form, not functioning properly means the sewage treatment system is causing a public health nuisance as defined under this section of law. So it would behoove you to get a copy of this. You can print it right off the internet, have it handy so that you know exactly what they call your systems. And those of you who are installers, you may get involved someday with us using this section to say that a person needs to replace their system. Is there any questions about that? Okay, let's move on then. All right, vertical separation distance. So we talked about the vertical separation distance and the minimums that we're going to see. We're going to see an 18-inch default, 36 inches for groundwater and bedrock, and probably 12 for seasonal perch water table. So here are things you can do to get closer to that. And this is a principle we saw in 2007. We're using it right now, but the same types of ideas. So number one, the vertical separation distance may be reduced using soil depth credits or through the use of an engineered drainage system to uniformly lower the seasonal water table. So if you had a situation like we described over there, where it was 24 inches to the seasonal perch water table, and you were able to design and install an engineered drainage system to bring it down to 36, you can pull that system further into the ground. Engineered drainage, not perimeter drains, not curtain drains, engineered drainage system. So there's one way you can do it. The next bullet down there, soil depth credits. What can we use for soil depth credits? As is always the case currently, one-to-one equivalency for elevating, so mounds, the farther, if you're at 12 inches to the seasonal perch water table currently, and you want to elevate with a mound to get to 24, that can be done as it already is being done. Pathogen reduction, most of you are familiar with the website that shows you the 1-foot soil depth credit, the 2-foot soil depth credit, the NPDES off-lot discharging improved aeration systems, all that. That's where you find those specifications for pathogen reduction on Ohio Department of Health's website. 12-inch, you get a 12-inch soil depth credit for drip distribution. And in parentheses there at the end, time microdose, and there is a maximum volume of water that can be dosed per day. So it's not just drip, it's drip with this special qualification, and most drip systems that go in are meeting that qualification. So it's not usually a problem. So 12 inches for that type of distribution. This last one sounds a little familiar because we came up with this in Stark County, and they used it in their new code. 6-inch soil depth credit for low pressure pipe with time dosing. So we said 6 inches for low pressure pipe, and they have the word time dosed low pressure pipe. You get a soil depth credit for that if you want to use low pressure pipe. Okay. I previously mentioned this already, but this is important because it lends itself toward cost. All septic tank effluent can be distributed by gravity when it meets the minimum 12-inch soil or vertical separation distance. Pre-treated effluent can be distributed by gravity if you're simply using it for the BOD TSS reduction, which is actually the square foot reduction you get. Gravity. Pre-treated effluent meeting the 1 or 2 foot pathogen reduction credit may be distributed by gravity. That's not what's happening right now, so that will remove pumps out of the systems and reduce the system cost. When is it required to apply effluent with low pressure distribution? Number one, it's required when you have a sand fill. Mounds, sand filters, at least the one type of sand filter, that's when it's required to have low pressure distribution. Okay, number two, soils in the top 1 or 2 rows of the Tyler table. What does that mean? The top 2 rows are the very coarse sands and gravels, loamy sands, those types of things. They're saying if you're in sand, and you're not going to get good treatment, they want you to spread that effluent out using low pressure pipe. So that's kind of a modification of what we're seeing today. That's maybe a little more strict than what we're doing today. That is, they're trying to accommodate for those highly permeable materials. So what happens when you have that, if you've got let's say a 75-foot trench in sand and gravel, what happens? When you've got coarse sands, that water comes in that trench and straight down it goes. The end of the system may not see water for any period of time. It'll eventually find its way out there over several years, but most of it's going to go straight down until a good thick biomat builds up. Then it starts going on. Here they're saying if you've got that kind of material, it's low pressure pipe, so you get it across that whole length of that trench. May also be required when the local health department believes the site and soil conditions warrant it. So we'll just leave that there. Soil infiltrated loading rates. Soil infiltration loading rates are determined by the Ohio table. And many of you have seen, you know that table. If you've been around this at all, you know that table. What they did, in fact, I think there's a slide of it. They cut apart the length. Now they have a length table, and they got a square foot table instead of having it together. So many of you are familiar with that. I won't spend much time on that. Yeah, Jim.
Back to your last one.
Yeah.
There'll be no more flood dosing.
No.
No more
You can do it. You can do it by preference.
Huh?
You can do it if you prefer it, but no, they did not incorporate that into the code. You know, and Jim, maybe let me explain a little bit about flood dosing. In 2007, what happened, because most of the state, including the state health department, were ill prepared, because what they basically said is if you had an aerator, this is the most common problem we had, you had an aerator, you needed to equally distribute effluent across the surface of the trench. And the only option they gave you was LPP. Bango. There goes the price tag. Not only was it LPP, but there were no provisions with multi-zone valves. So you might have 4 lines of an LPP system coming after an aerator that you had to dose the entire LPP system all at one time. 100 GPD, or 100 or gallons per minute, GPM, coming out of that system. That means the pump was huge, the head was high, it was expensive. So what we ended up doing here locally was, because that was such a problem, I mean, it just threw the cost through the roof. We came up with using multi-zone valves for LPP, which made it so maybe you only needed a quarter of the flow. You had 4 lines, you only really needed a quarter of that flow. So from 100, it went down to 25, which made it so that the cost went down, the pump cost went down. And then we also came up with flood dosing, because the whole idea of equal distribution, where we said, you know, not everybody wants to use LPP, and there's inherent risk with LPP and plugging and so forth. So how about we throw this other option in there? That was our answer to the high cost problem in 2007 that was happening. So now the thing that warrants not even needing it anymore is because they said you can distribute by gravity, where in 2007 you couldn't. So it's better than flow dosing. So anyway, that's a little history of where it came from and why we used it for the last 5 years. or 6 years, and why we needed something to accommodate for it. All right, so here's, Paul.
When they take the pump out, now it's gravity, are they going to increase the field size by 25, 30%, like they did under current rules?
That's a good question. I think you're going to find, I don't know the answer to that. We'd have to read that in the appendices on actually how they're wanting that to be done. I don't know the answer. I think you're going to see, I think there's a section, if I'm not mistaken from what I previously had read, that you add 25% to the system size for the sake of resting. So when you're going by gravity, we're back to the old days of diverting, and more commonly today we're diverting 25% instead of 50%. Because, in the day, we have large systems in the day. So if you take 50% out of commission and you rest it, that's a lot of system that doesn't have access for water. And if you only take a quarter, that's a whole lot less. So I'm thinking what we're going to see is a 25% resting. So you might see the 25% getting added to the length or to the square footage of the system. Yeah, I'm fairly certain, but I don't want to say that for sure. So these are the tables now. Many of you recognize this, but like I said, it's been cut off. The rest of it's not shown here now. So this is the section we use to determine the square footage of the system. And if you're not familiar, basically you have a column that accommodates for septic tank effluent and a column that for pre-treated effluent. So if you pre-treat, you get a reduction in the size of your system. Hydraulic lineal loading rate. Again, there's not much to say here except you're probably mostly already familiar with this, that dictates the minimum length on the contour. We're trying to use the contour to spread out the effluent. In days past, we didn't always care so much about length, but now they do, and they have found that the farther you distribute that across the contour, the better that water will stay in the ground, and that's really what you're after. I wonder if it said it back here. I should mention this. This is a little nuance that I maybe should throw out there because it's a little different the way we interpret it right now. This is back to the square footage determination. We're supposed to use only the first 6 inches underneath the infiltrative surface to determine. So if you're in the ground 12 inches, we're only supposed to use the first 6 inches below that to determine the square footage. So if there's impermeable soil layers deeper down, we're not necessarily supposed to look at that, but there is a however. And the however is found at the very end here. Below the upper 6 inches, unless it's significantly less permeable. In the past, we would look at, in many cases, 12, 18, 24 inches underneath of that where that water is being applied. But now they're saying the top 6. So that may dictate different square footage of systems. On the other hand, the length is determined by everything until you hit the limiting layer, which is what we're doing for both of them now. So they've kind of made one less strict and kept the one the same. I don't know why, but that's what they're doing there. Of course, here's the table then for determining length. Again, many of you have already seen that many times in the past. And we previously mentioned about the using LPP when you have coarse soils, and we said it was the top 2 rows. That's these. Coarse sand and gravels, fine sand, loamy sand, very fine sand. Those are the sands that will require the use of LPP for equal distribution from that one section I previously mentioned. All right. There are some things that can be done to become less restrictive with the use of hydraulic lineal loading rate. And I guess the best thing I can do is just read these. Decreasing the hydraulic lineal loading rate for designs where the infiltrative distance is less than 8 inches. Now, when you say decrease, that means the length gets bigger. When you decrease the number for the HLLR, the length gets bigger. So if the infiltrative distance is less than 8 inches, the length's going to get longer.